I was presented with this by one of my rabbis who was trying to convince me of the absolute authority of the rabbis. I would come to my rabbis and say, but this interpretation doesn't make sense, and that interpretation doesn't make sense. That's not really what it says. And ultimately, one day, my rabbi sat me down and said, Nehemia, you got to stop this. You have to accept the authority of the rabbis, whether you agree with their interpretation or not. And he's told me a story from the Talmud to illustrate this point. And this is the famous story of Rabbi Eliezer, who was one of the greatest rabbis at the end of the first century. And the story goes that Rabbi Eliezer was debating with all the other rabbis on some small point of rabbinic law. And Rabbi Eliezer had one opinion, all the other rabbis in the academy had another opinion, and Rabbi Eliezer knew he was right, but he couldn't convince them. So the Talmud says that Rabbi Eliezer brought every rational and scriptural argument in the world that he could, and the rabbis weren't convinced. And finally he breaks down and he says, I'm going to prove this through a miracle. And he invokes a miracle and he says, if I'm right, let the river prove it. And they hear this great rumbling and they look outside and there's a river, the river's flowing backwards. And the rabbis admit, this is a miracle. Yeah. But they turn to Rabbi Eliezer and they say to him, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to rivers. He invokes another miracle. He says, if I'm right, let the trees prove it. And there's a miracle with trees flying in the air, being ripped out of the ground. They look at this, they recognize this as a miracle and say, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to trees. He has a third miracle. He says, if I'm right, let the walls of the academy cave in. And they again recognize this as a genuine miracle. Sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to walls. Okay, valid comeback. Finally, he says, if I'm right, let heaven prove it. And according to the Talmud, a voice came out from heaven and said, why do you dispute with my servant Rabbi Eliezer? He's right in everything that he says. And the rabbis hear this and they recognize this is a heavenly voice, that this is a form of prophecy that's come down. But they say, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer, we don't listen to heaven.
Wow.
And then they quote a verse from Scripture, Deuteronomy chapter 30, where it says that the Torah is not in heaven. And if you look there in the context, what it's really talking about is that it says the Torah is not across the sea or in heaven. It's in your mouth and in your heart. And it's not too difficult. There's no excuse not to do it.
Oh, yeah.
But they take those, in Hebrew, 3 words, it is not in heaven, lo b'shamayim hi, and say what that means is the Torah is not in heaven and God has no say in how to interpret it. So they recognize this is a heavenly voice. They recognize this heavenly voice has declared Rabbi Eliezer to be correct, but God has no say in interpreting Scripture. And I remember when my rabbi told me this story, up until then I was torn inside. I had these doubts about the oral law and the way of the rabbis, but I was raised in it. And for generations, many of my ancestors were top rabbis. And so it was very difficult to give that up. But when I was told this story, I turned to my rabbi and I genuinely thanked him. And I said, that's all I needed to hear. Now I know this is not of God.
Gosh, it's striking, though, that clergymen would say God does not have the authority we do.
Right. It's the ultimate endowment of man with an authority literally above that of God. If a prophet comes, they will not listen to him, even if they recognize him as having genuine prophecy, because their authority is absolute on earth.
No wonder when the prophets came, they did not listen.